Life in fairy tales seems easy enough. We know who to cheer for and who to root against. But do we? And who are those stories for? In her new book, Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability and Making Space, author Amanda Leduc takes us back to those formative stories for another eye opening look. And Amanda Leduc is with us now from her home in Hamilton, Ontario. Amanda, it's very nice to meet you under these circumstances. Thank you for being on the show.
It's lovely to
Uh,
meet you too, Nam. Thanks so much.
So I was lucky enough to get an advance copy of your book, and when I read it, I was actually very mad at myself for not knowing a lot of the backstories to these stories because I have two small kids, and we watch Disney movies all the time. When you wrote this book, you approached it as part memoir and part critical analysis. Why did you approach it that way?
Well, the book sort of came together quite organically. I had pitched it to the Coach House Exploded Views series initially, and those are short cultural criticism books. And I wasn't really thinking about it as part memoir initially, but as I began writing and started delving deeper into different fairy tales and what they do and sort of how they structure the world, especially for people with disabilities, it just seemed like a natural evolution to include my own story. I am a disabled woman. I have cerebral palsy. And even though I didn't realize it at the time when I was a child and exposed to fairy tales, they really had a huge impact on how I viewed myself and my disabled body in the world. And so it was really interesting to go back to all of those stories and go through my memories of them from when I was a child to reconstruct what it means to, you know, be a disabled person in the world today and look at the stories that are told about disabled people.
You said that when you were writing the book, it made you realize the impact that they had on you as a child. Looking back, what were those impacts?
Well, I think so. I have cerebral palsy, but it's quite mild. So it shows up with a limp on my right hand side. And so I could pass for a large majority of my youth as someone who was able bodied. And I think for a lot of disabled people who maybe have that opportunity of being able to pass at times or pretend that you're not disabled, you do it because it's a survival tactic. You pretend like you can walk and just act and move just like everybody else because then you won't get picked on, you won't get set apart when you're in school and in other social situations. So that's what I did. I pretended for a long time that I wasn't disabled. It's sort of a weird sort of mental gymnastics because I would say that I have cerebral palsy. I had surgeries when I was younger. I was in a wheelchair for a while. I used crutches, but I wasn't really considering myself a disabled person. And when I looked at stories, especially the stories that we see in Disney, I wanted to see myself as a Disney princess. So I pretended that I, was as able-bodied and as capable of a happy ending as a Disney princess without realizing that what I was doing was trying to mold and shift and shape my life into something that it maybe wasn't meant for. My life included different things, included a different
And
kind of happy ending.
and as a child, I don't know if you could remember when that shift happened, where you saw yourself differently. It must have been painful, no?
It was hard when I was in elementary school specifically. There was a fair amount of bullying just in terms of how I walked because I walked just differently enough to be singled out and be picked on as a result of that. In the book, one of the studies that I cite looked at children who had cerebral palsy or other muscular disorders. And one of the things that they found was that children who have disorders or had muscular disorders and their disabilities were mild tended to be picked on more than children whose disabilities were more severe. And I have theories about why that is the case. I think there's something about picking on someone who's almost like you, but not quite, punching
Because it's not
down.
Mhm. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But as a child, you really loved fairy tales. I think it's fair to say you're kind of obsessed by them.
Yeah.
What did you like about fairy tales?
I mean, I still love fairy tales, despite the fact that I will also say that they're very problematic. I liked the idea of a happy ending, and I liked the idea of the order that a fairy tale subscribed to show the world.
That's
The idea
interesting. What do
that,
you mean order?
well, the idea that if you work really hard or if you're a really good person, you'll get your happy ending. Like everything that you want will come to you in the end. There was something very comforting about that for me as a child, because I could say, you're being bullied, you're being picked on, but it's okay. If you're a good person, you will triumph over all of this and everything will work out fine in the end for you. And in many ways it did. And then in other ways, it didn't. There are realities of my disabled life that will always be with me and are maybe not as conducive to the idea of a happy ending. But the process and the journey of writing the book and recognizing the damage that this sort of keeping to this kind of narrative can do, the idea that there's a particular kind of happy ending, and if you don't fit into that happy ending, then you don't get to be the kind of person who has good things come to them in life, which seems really simplistic, but I think that's what fairy tales often do, is they sort of impose a very simplistic view of the world onto how we live, particularly for people who are disabled.
And I guess if it's kind of like a blueprint on how you can get the happy ending, and if you don't get that happy ending, then it means that there's something wrong with you, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It doesn't come to you, then you don't deserve it, or you maybe didn't work hard enough for it, or you weren't good enough. That's very damaging.
As a child, what was your favorite fairy tale and why?
Oh, I love The Little Mermaid, the Disney version in particular. I didn't read the original Hans Christian Andersen version until much later. My sister and I would swim in our backyard pool and pretend to be Ariel. Um, I think there was just something very, very exotic, both about the way that she moved as a mermaid, but then about the way that she triumphed in the end. I found something very exciting and engaging about that in particular.
We have a clip from The Little Mermaid, and then we'll come back and
Yay.
talk. Tony, could you please roll?
Well, look at what the catfish dragged in. Look at you. Look at you. There's something different.
Watching that as a child did what to you?
I, looking back on it now, as a child, I didn't see myself in Ariel right when she gets her legs for the first time, right? She's stumbling around on that beach. She doesn't have any balance. She's very sort of unsure of herself. And I didn't see myself in that, even though I should have, because of what I wanted to see and what I sort of taught myself to see as a child was I was going to walk the way that Ariel walks at the end of the film, where she's walking perfectly normally as a human being. Um, and I wish, looking back on it now, I wish that I had been able to see it a little bit differently. I wish that I had had exposure to stories of disability, disabled children specifically, because I think it would have given me more confidence in myself and the way, the fact that I limped and the fact that I didn't walk like everybody else. I would have just seen it differently and moved differently throughout the world, had more confidence as a result.
Well, in the book, you ask, what messages do we internalize as disabled children when we see a world that looks as easy on the screen and then struggle with the world in real life? What are those messages?
Well, I think children who are disabled, in my case, children who are physically disabled like me, often get a lot of messages where, people with very, very good intentions, parents with very good intentions, will take their children to physical therapy and, try and help them so that they walk more appropriately or more normally. And that, works well for some children. I went to physical therapy as a child, and it helped me to walk in ways that, made sure that my foot wasn't painful and things like that. But other children who, maybe have more difficulty with walking and adults too, not just children, endure physical therapy and a lot of pain in order to walk normally. And there's this idea that the only way that you're going to succeed or get ahead in life is if you walk a certain way or you move a certain way. And what we really need to be doing is starting to ask, what difference does it make? If a child maybe can't walk, why are we putting resources into putting them in physical therapy and having these kinds of conversations about walking as a sort of ultimate goal, when really we should be looking at the disabled child's body, their own specific body, and what can we do to make them more comfortable? What can we do to make it so that they can move through the world in a way that's comfortable for them, and also doesn't, so that they don't encounter any barriers. It's the old sort of folktale in the disability community is, you have two doorways into a building. One is a doorway with a ramp and the other is a doorway with stairs. And the person in the wheelchair is waiting at the ramp while the custodian is clearing snow away from the stairs. And the wheelchair person says, can you clear the ramp first, please? And they say, oh, well, I have to clear the stairs so that all these people can get in. And the person in the wheelchair then says, well, but if you clear the ramp, then everybody can go in at the same time. Whereas if you clear the stairs first, that means that I have to wait until you're done. And I think there's this idea that, disability and accommodations and making things accessible is catering to a very specific segment of the population, when in actual fact, what it's doing is taking care of everybody at the same time. And if we teach children that their bodies are perfect just the way that they are, and that, the focus isn't so much on, for example, making it so that a child can walk, but making it so that that child is comfortable in the body that they have, then you create a society that's much more inclusive and much more conducive to allowing people to reach their full potential.
I know in the book that you do write about this, and you don't have to talk about it if you don't feel comfortable, but you do write about when you were younger, you did have a number of surgeries,
Mm.
and your parents, the people, your community, with the best intentions, but it affected you in a certain way. Do you feel comfortable talking about that?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
How did all those surgeries affect you?
Well, I think as a child, I can remember being sort of an exotic curiosity, right? Because I had a wheelchair when I was in first grade for a number of months. So there was, it was very exciting at first because people got to push me around on the playground, and I got to give presentations about what life was like in a wheelchair and those kind of things. And that got old for other kids in the class very quickly. But I was sort of left with, the difficulties of having to move in a wheelchair, having to have a cast, having to deal with all of that. And it just, when you're a child, one of the things that you want, I think, because we're taught to want these things, is to be like everybody else. Nobody wants to be ostracized. Nobody wants to be put outside of the community. And so, for a long time, once I didn't have the wheelchair anymore, once the cast came off, once I was no longer using crutches, it was very much about, for me, trying to blend in with everybody else. I think because certainly, I mean, this is 30 years ago now, certainly at that time, we weren't really being actively taught about being kind and open to people who look different, and understanding that everybody has a different way of moving in the world. I think we're much more advanced now in our society, and in terms of looking at those kinds of things and really trying deeply to understand what it means to have a kind of visible difference in that way. And then from there, looking at invisible disabilities and how those impact people and how they move through the world as well. I think we still got a long way to go, though. When you're a child and you sort of encounter that ostracization when you're quite young, it really puts you on a certain path. It really kind of instills some very deep ideas within you about what your body is and what kinds of value your body has. And that was, yeah, it took a long time for me to move beyond that and to really understand how much that experience of ostracization and bullying when I was in school had shaped my life and shaped my sort of expectations of myself and my value, really, as a person in the world.
You also write in the book that within fairy tales themselves, that disability is used as a symbol. In what ways
Mm.
is disability used as a symbol in fairy tales?
Well, in a lot of the fairy tales that we know and are familiar with in Western culture, you have villains who are marked in some way. So, you have the understanding that the witch in Hansel and Gretel, one of the versions of that tale, the witch comes to Hansel and Gretel on crutches. And the idea is that, they think that she's harmless because she's on crutches. She's not going to hurt them in any way. And, that links that disability to deception. You have things like the wicked stepmother who transforms herself into an ugly hag to help, or to deceive, rather, in the guise of helping Snow White. You have characters like Rumpelstiltskin, who is quote unquote an ugly hunchback dwarf, who in his own way is deceiving the princess. And there's this idea that if people look differently, then it marks them as other. It marks them as a villain, as someone that you're supposed to avoid. And that goes back to that idea of simplicity, right? In fairy tales, we sort of are given this world where it's very clearly set out for you. Bad people look like this, and good people look like this. And even though I think it's something that we look at as adults, you look back on it and you say, well, those are just fairy tales. They're just stories for children. Obviously, the world doesn't subscribe to that anymore. But then you look at things like, superhero films or James Bond films, for example. I think since Daniel Craig started as James Bond, 3 out of the 4 Bond villains have had facial scarring.
Mhm.
So you still see that idea that people who are evil or, bad, are marked as such in some way. And I think it speaks to, the sense that people do really on some level wish for a world that is that simple, right? And we know that it's not. It's much easier to think about a world where you can go outside and say, okay, these people are bad and these are people I should avoid, and these people are good and these are the people that I want to be with. And, marking someone physically as different has a huge part to play in that. And so
And we,
oh,
so sorry, I was just going to say, but we forget that they are also people.
yes, exactly. And that's what disability as, a mark of villainy does in these fairy tales and these superhero films that we see. If disability is only ever a marker of showing, how bad you are on the inside, it's not actually a lived reality for somebody. The other way that disability functions in fairy tales is it's sort of an impediment, or, a problem that a protagonist has to solve in order to get to their happy ending. There's a fairy tale called Haun's My Hedgehog by the brothers Grimm, and in it there's a half hedgehog, half human boy, and he sort of goes through a series of adventures trying to prove himself to his family and his town. And at the end of the story, he marries a princess, and then he reveals to her in secret that his hedgehogness is only a costume, and he enlists her help to be rid of the costume for once and for all. And so he ends the tale as a quote unquote beautiful, attractive, young human man. And you get the sense that even though he fought to be accepted as a half human, half hedgehog being, that is essentially what he wanted all along, was to be human and to have this sort of conventionally attractive body. And that, people internalize that to a huge degree.
Because in real life, that doesn't change.
In real life, that doesn't change. And I just think it does a huge disservice to people who have to live with the various realities of disability in their own lives, when they continually see in the media either, people who look like them are painted as bad characters, or people who look like them are, encounter some kind of magic on the screen or on the page that makes them look beautiful and different at the end. It's incredibly unfair and incredibly simplistic. And I just really want us to think about the ways in which portrayals like that of disability have a huge impact on people's lives and how they move through the world.
I want to show you another clip, and this is from way back in 1937. And this
Oof.
is a clip of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And this was actually the first Disney movie. And then we'll talk some more. Tony, could you please roll?
Oh dear.
How did the success of that movie set the stage for what you call the Disneyfication of fairy tales?
Mm. Well, I think with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in particular, Disney had been familiar with the Brothers Grimm version of the tale. And in researching for the film and sort of getting his plan together, one of the things that he talked about and was written about was that he thought that there was a certain amount of comedic license that he could take with the dwarfs in particular. So in the Brothers Grimm version of the tale, the dwarfs don't have names. So he gave them names and he gave them personalities. And he also, I mean, you can see it even in that clip, right? The dwarfs all, for example, have rather large bulbous noses that are used for a kind of cute comedic effect as they pop over the ends of the bed. And there's a very clear sort of delineation between what the dwarfs look like. Yes, they're kind and good, but they have this humble cottage in the woods. And, Snow White is a princess. And at the end of the tale, they stay in their cottage in the woods, and she goes on to live in a castle. So there's one of the activists that I spoke with in the course of writing the book was Rebecca Coakley, who is a senior fellow in disability policy for the Center for American Progress in the States. She is a little person, and has talked quite openly and quite often on Twitter and elsewhere about the ways in which, even though the depictions of the dwarfs in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the Disney film specifically, are meant to, draw laughs and be kind of like a warm and fuzzy thing, that has a huge impact on her and her life and the lives of little people all over the world, because there's this sense that, they don't get taken seriously, right? Because the images that you're shown of little people in shows like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and in other television and in other stories, literary stories that we read, sort of play that same thing out. And what Disney did, though, in creating that narrative was he sort of happened on a formula, right? Where he could get the friendly sidekick who maybe looks a little differently or, a little comedic, and get more out of that in the course of telling the tales. So even if you look at something like Beauty and the Beast, for example, the Disney version of Beauty and the Beast, you've got Gaston, who is this tall, strapping man. I mean, we're also made to understand that he is also not necessarily the greatest of characters, but he has a foil, right, in LeFou, who is his sort of trusty sidekick, who is short and round and plump in contrast to Gaston, and is portrayed in a way that very clearly pokes fun at him and the kind of person that he is versus the kind of person that Gaston is. And again, I don't know necessarily that these depictions are done initially with any kind of malice, but they're also done without any kind of real calculated thought as to how that impacts people who maybe don't look like Gaston, and might look differently. And
And
I
can
just
you
really
even
want
that?
people to think.
I will leave a few minutes, but even to think that Belle, her shortcoming is that she likes to read, like that's something wrong. But
I know.
I know there's some people watching this and even listening to the podcast, and they might be like, "What is the big deal? It's just a story. It's a fairy tale. It's not real." Why do the stories we tell children become this story children tell themselves?
Well, I think fairy tales and the kind of simplistic stories that we tell children when they are very small set you up, like they set you up for a very specific way of viewing the world. The fact that I read fairy tales when I was young really instilled in me this idea that if you were a good person and you do everything that you need to do, and you do lots of good deeds and you take care of yourself and you take care of others, everything will work out for you in the end. Because the stories that I read, fairy tales as a child, were simplistic in that way. Everything did work out for the protagonist. And I think it does a real disservice. We have to show kids that the world is complicated. We also have to show kids that everybody occupies the world in a different way. We all have different bodies, and everybody's bodies and ways of moving through the world are valued and important. And the more that we show kids that and teach them that, the more accepting and open they are to these other kinds of experiences. And it's really important. I really think it's something, I still love fairy tales. I still come back to them. I read them to my nieces. I still love Disney films, even though I can say that they're very problematic at the same time. I just think that we need to be a little more critical with how we view this kind of media and really use it to ask questions about
And I
these
think it,
kinds of things.
and I think it also goes back to the title, part of your title, where it's making space and who's
Hmm.
telling these stories.
Yes, exactly. We need to understand that we all deserve to be here. And those of us who've maybe had more space in the past, it's our responsibility to make space for others.
Amanda, thank you so much. This is essential reading. There's so much in it. And I think it's helpful for everybody to read it to get an idea of how these Disney fairy tales have been reimagined and to find out the original stories, because some of these stories are just so problematic. Amanda, thank you so much and congratulations on this wonderful book.
Thank you, Nam.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.